It's the late 90s. The Super Nintendo had been succeeded by the N64, the PlayStation was leading the latest console generation, and production of the Sega Saturn had already been discontinued. Nintendo, however, still had a monopoly on the handheld market with their successful Game Boy line, and a few other companies were trying to stake a claim in portable gaming hardware. At the time, Nintendo's original Game Boy was almost 10 years old, and it began to show signs of its age. Despite the handheld's large and loyal audience, there was still a call for significant improvements in the portable gaming market. Enter SNK. After attempting to find a foothold in the console scene with their Neo Geo MVS and AES systems, SNK decided to tackle the portable gaming giant known as Nintendo. The result was the Neo Geo Pocket. Released in late 1998, the Neo Geo Pocket was a commercial failure, due mostly to its exclusive Japanese release. Only 10 games were ever produced for the Neo Geo Pocket, due to its short shelf life, and by 1999, the original NGP had faded into obscurity. But SNK's foray into portable hardware didn't end with that abrupt failure. About a year after the release of the initial NGP, gamers were given a second opportunity at SNK On The Go. The Neo Geo Pocket Color was released worldwide in 1999, hitting American shelves on August 6th. It enjoyed the most success out of any Game Boy competitor outside of Japan since Sega's Game Gear in 1991. So in anticipation of the Neo Geo X Gold coming out this December, I figured why not go back in time and learn a little bit about a cult classic. First, let's look at the actual hardware. The Neo Geo Pocket Color was designed very similarly to its predecessor. All the buttons are in the same place and the general shape of the handheld is the same. It feels very comfortable. The whole thing is horizontally set, meaning your hands aren't too close together, and the back of the system was probably made with comfort in mind, as there are places for your fingers to naturally fall into place. The buttons are easy to reach, and the screen is large enough to accommodate your average gamer. Speaking of the screen, it has no front or backlight, meaning you'll need to be in a well-lit environment in order to play. Aesthetically, it's not too busy. You just have 4 buttons, a digital joystick, more on that soon, a few logos, and there you go. It's a simple design, and overall, it's effective, practically and visually. Like most portable systems in the 90s, the Neo Geo Pocket Color requires batteries. The system needs 2 AA batteries to run games, and a CR2032 battery to set the clock and settings.
Wait, what? Yeah, the Neo Geo Pocket Color had a built-in clock, along with an alarm, a calendar, and a horoscope generator, all of which you had to set up the first time you turned the system on. It seems a bit excessive if you ask me, especially considering the time this thing came out, but when you think about it, the Japanese target audience was really big on personal organizers, so the integration makes sense from a marketing standpoint.
Besides, even with all of that, the Neo Geo Pocket Color uses fewer batteries than the original Game Boy, which required 4 AA's to run, and lasts twice as long as the Game Boy Pocket. The games themselves are cartridge-based, just like the Game Boy. Unlike the Game Boy, however, the games have 16-bit graphics, meaning they're much brighter and more colorful than Nintendo's. But how are the actual games? Let's play a few and find out.
Keep in mind I'm reviewing the system itself and not the individual games, which means I won't be as detailed in my analysis of each game. Maybe someday I'll go back and review them a little bit more in depth, but for now, we're just looking at the hardware as a whole.
Also, because I'm not one for emulation, the only way I can capture gameplay footage is by pointing the camera at the system, so please excuse the primitive recording style. First up, we have Fatal Fury First Contact. Appropriate enough. For those of you unfamiliar with the Fatal Fury franchise, it's a fighting game developed by SNK, making this a first-party title. The game plays well on the system. You have a fairly wide selection of characters, which includes plenty of Fatal Fury mainstays. The actual gameplay feels pretty fluid. It's easy to do combos, and the special attacks are still as satisfying as ever. Graphically, the game is great. It utilizes the Neo Geo Pocket Color's palette very well, and the art style is charming. The music, however, isn't any better than the original Game Boy, and the sound as a whole lacks the same punch as Nintendo's handheld. Pardon the pun. But let's give it the benefit of the doubt for now, and say that it's just the game, not the system itself. Next is Samurai Showdown 2, a fitting follow-up. Again, it's a fighting game franchise by SNK. The graphics are similar to Fatal Fury First Contact, but the music isn't any better. In fact, I'll make the argument that the music in First Contact was much more fitting to the gameplay than the music in Samurai Showdown 2. And I'll even go out on a limb and say that Fatal Fury First Contact looks better than Samurai Showdown 2. Gameplay-wise, it feels fine, but it's a bit rigid on the input, so you'll have some miscalculation from time to time. Overall, it's a decent game, but not the killer app the Neo Geo Pocket Color needed. Alongside these fighting games, the system also had a nice lineup of role-playing games as well. The first RPG released for the handheld was Biomotor Unitron. It's a meticulously paced game and requires a lot of patience. You pick your character from a fairly decent selection of protagonists, and once the game gets underway, you can start customizing your Unitron, which is the robot you use for battles. The game is fun, but it's not as easy to permeate as Nintendo's portable RPG, Pokémon. The music is generic. It's not bad, but nothing stands out. It's more of your typical RPG music, and while it certainly sounds good, it's nothing memorable. Overall, an interesting game worth checking out, but nothing too important to have unless you want variety. Moving right along, let's try out the King of Fighters R2.
Another SNK fighting game? I'm starting to notice a trend here. This is to be expected, however. Before dabbling in the handheld market, SNK had its own arcade cabinet and home console, the Neo Geo Multi-Video System, and the Neo Geo Advanced Entertainment System.
Those two systems were the starting point for many of SNK's franchises, such as Super Sidekicks and the Metal Slug series. But it was clear from the beginning that SNK's forte was fighting games, and they released a whole slew of fighters for the MVS and AES, such as King of Fighters, Art of Fighting, Fatal Fury, Samurai Showdown, The Last Blade, World Heroes, and many more. With that in mind, it's easy to see why the Neo Geo Pocket Color's library is loaded with fighting games, and it's easier to understand the hardware design once you know that. You see, instead of a traditional D-pad like the Game Boy line, the Neo Geo Pocket line features a digital joystick, something made especially for fighting games. You still see them on some fighting pads today. It has an 8-directional input, and makes combos easier to pull off because its design is smoother and more intuitive for that type of gameplay when compared to a directional pad. However, it made playing other genres a bit more difficult, so the controls for both the Game Boy and the Pocket Color were basically on a level playing field. But let's get back to King of Fighters R2. Right off the bat, you're treated to some of the best music any handheld at the time had to offer. Now this is what I'm talking about. This is chiptune music at its finest, and not only does it sound great on its own, but it meshes with the gameplay very well. Speaking of gameplay, R2 controls incredibly well. It doesn't feel like a stripped-down version of King of Fighters, it just feels like King of Fighters on the go. I can say this is a must-have if you own a Neo Geo Pocket Color.
That was just a small handful of games, and you probably have a general idea of what to expect for the system now. It's an underrated handheld with some great titles. The hardware was technically superior to the Game Boys, and it even had a worldwide release. So if you're like me, you're probably wondering, why couldn't the Neo Geo Pocket Color topple Nintendo's portable juggernaut? It certainly had all the traits to do so. Well, there were many reasons.
First of all, it came out way too late. While the 10-year-old Game Boy had lower specifications than its newer rivals, the flip side is that the Game Boy already had 10 years worth of games in its library, and Nintendo's handheld was proven to work in the eyes of developers. Even if it was getting a little old, the system was still going strong, and various revisions in design over the years made it much more available than the Pocket Color. Second, the NGPC had virtually no third-party support. I showed you 4 games for the system, and they all have one thing in common. They were all published by SNK. There were only 10 or so third-party developers for the Neo Geo Pocket Color, far fewer than on the Game Boy, meaning the Pocket Color's library potential was much more limited. Even the first-party support wasn't as strong as Nintendo's lineup. How do you compete with Mario, Zelda, Metroid, and Pokemon? You just can't. Third, it faced stiff competition from other rival handhelds. Despite international success, the Neo Geo Pocket Color couldn't break into the Japanese market. Why? Well, on March 4th, 1999, Bandai released the WonderSwan, an affordable handheld gaming device that was very popular with the Japanese audience. And unlike SNK's Neo Geo, the WonderSwan had major support from third-party developers, like Square and Capcom. This would allow Bandai to claim about 9% of the Japanese portable gaming market, way more than any other non-Nintendo handheld. And finally, Nintendo was still breaking into its portable stride. Remember how I said the original Neo Geo Pocket was discontinued after just a year on the market? Well, in between the existence of the Neo Geo Pocket and the Neo Geo Pocket Color, Nintendo released the Game Boy Color, which had the same general specs as the Game Boy, except with much more RAM and a broader color palette. This new, colored version of the Game Boy forced SNK and Bandai to upgrade their initially monochrome handhelds to have color displays. But in the end, the redesign just wasn't enough to keep up with Nintendo's portable juggernaut, and the Game Boy Color outsold both the Neo Geo Pocket Color and the WonderSwan Color. The final nail in the coffin came at the end of both handhelds' lifespans, as Nintendo's new Game Boy Advance was looming just on the horizon, rendering the SNK handheld and the Bandai handheld obsolete.
I could keep talking about the Pocket Color and its library of games, but I mainly wanted to give you a history lesson on one of the more obscure and underrated portable systems from the past.
I know I missed a few popular games like Metal Slug, Rockman Battle and Fighters, and Farsalai, but if I don't have the game, then I can't review it accurately.
As for the system itself, you can pick it up for anywhere from $60 to $150, depending on the condition. The games will run you anywhere from $10 to $40, and a few games are priced at over $100 a piece. So while it might not be a requirement for the average gamer, it's certainly interesting to have if you're mildly curious in owning a piece of mobile gaming history. And when December rolls around, you can bet your ass on picking up the Neo Geo X Gold. Thanks for watching.